I always thought binding was the worst, just the last annoying step of quilting before you can finally enjoy what you've made. But lately it's changed to one of my favorite parts. So stick around because today I've got a bunch of quilt binding tips to make binding your next quilt easier and more enjoyable. Hello and welcome to another quilting video. I'm Olivia and today we're talking about quilt binding. I have a different video that's about binding tutorial and I'll link that down below. But this video is the extras on top of that one. Number one is to experiment with the width of your cut binding strips. If we have a look at the front of all of these quilts, they're pretty similar, right? I always attach them with the same seam allowance from the edge of my quilt going over. I generally just use the side of my presser foot as my seam allowance. But the backs of these are pretty different. This one is quite wide. This one's a little skinnier. I think this one here is my sweet spot. Lately I've been cutting my fabric 2¼ inches wide, and I really like this one because the front and the back are very similar width. I don't like so much some of these older ones. The back is so much wider than the front. And I know I could make that more similar, but I'm very happy with this very skinny one right now. And it really is just personal preference. So play around with different widths. There's no right or wrong with this one. This is just something that can make it a little more fun as you're binding more and more and more quilts. Just play around with it. Number two is to zigzag the edge of your quilt before you add the binding. I've seen people use a serger, which I think is a great idea, but I don't have one of those. And zigzagging works really well. It keeps the edges of your quilt nice and thin and combined together, which makes it a little easier to wrap your binding around the edge when it gets to that point. It's an extra step, it takes a little longer, but for me it's very worth it for how much easier the next steps are. Number three, you might have noticed me doing this if you've watched my other videos, and I know not everybody likes to do it this way, but I like to add my binding to the front of my quilt before I trim my quilt. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, it is just easier for me to physically maneuver it through my sewing machine with that extra bulk on the side. And number two, it makes it easier for me to square up my quilt edge, right? Maybe say if this patch were a little bit skinnier, it didn't quite line up with this one, but I can make it line up with the binding. If I trim them all down first, that's just less of an option. So for those two reasons, I like to do that first. Before I press, before I bind, then I cut the excess batting and backing off. That also goes back to the zigzag, which makes it easier to cut off the excess after that zigzag is done. So I just said press. My next tip is to press the binding back before you wrap it around. You can even see on these quilts here. This one, I don't think I did that. And it's much rounder, and this one is a much flatter binding. And it's subtle, but not only do these two look better, it is easier. It's much simpler when you've pressed this batting down, because then you're only wrapping it around. You're not struggling to get it this way. Next tip is for when we're making the actual binding, before we get to adding it onto the quilt. When we're making these stitches here, combining your two strips of binding fabric, use a much smaller stitch length. This is especially important if, like me, you like to use a bit of a darker binding fabric, but you also only really use white thread. I never really change out the thread that I'm using, and so if I just use the standard stitch length on my machine, you can kind of see here on this one how you get these little white, you can see the thread through it. but a smaller stitch length makes that much less visible. I also think it makes it a little stronger, which is probably what you want for binding. So just a small thing that I think makes the binding look much neater at the end. And finally, we have binding clips. I was always kind of against binding clips, to be honest. I didn't see the point. I didn't think I needed them, but I found them on sale one day and bought them on a whim, and I love them so much. I never want to go back to binding without them. It just takes one thing off your mind when you can use these little guys, get the binding wrapped around nicely, and all you need to worry about is your stitching. I've never actually tried them for machine binding, but for hand binding, 100 times easier. I love them so much. I wouldn't say they're necessary. I definitely bound a lot of quilts without them, but I wouldn't want to do it now that I've got them. So I'll leave a link for these guys down below. I just have the mini size, which I think is a good size for the width of binding that I like to make. I like this size. I like that there's a variety of colors, and they just make things a lot easier. Okay, I want to talk about how to combine the two edges of your binding once you've sewed on all the way around and you've come back to the end here, because I've never really been very good at this step. But the last handful of quilts I've done, I finally feel like I've got into a good rhythm where finally, like, you can't tell what was the last one. You know, a lot of my quilts you can see. Let's talk about that. You want to leave a good long length of binding unattached to the quilt on both sides. I always attached one side a little too much, which gave me a lot of trouble. So you want long tails, and it's important that you know exactly how wide your binding was, because that's how we're going to trim it here. I'm going to take this one, chop it straight, and now this length, this binding is 2¼ inches wide, so I'm going to cut this length 2¼ inches longer past this cut. Now chop that, and now with all of this space we can put them together, and that's all you really need to know to get that nice clean binding. I'm going to pin these here with that same fold like we do with all the other binding strips. Give it a check, looks good. So now I'm going to cut, press closed, press open, and now press the fold, and now it can sew on. Another tip for hand binding tips is to experiment with the thread you're using on the back. This one, I matched my binding color to my thread color, and I love how you get the texture of the hand quilting, but it's a little more subtle than, for example, this one, where I've used the dark yellow fabric and the white thread. I did the same with this one. I matched the dark blue with a dark blue thread. I kind of did that with this. I used white thread and I did tiny stitches to only be in the white stripes, which is probably a little overkill, but it's another way to just add another little something. In the same way, play around with how you do the corners of your binding. I think I talked about this in my previous binding video. My favorite thing to do is a little X in the corner. I think that is best combination of cute and functional. So there you have it, my favorite tips for binding a quilt. Like I said earlier, I love this part of quilting now. Ever since I've started doing all of these things, it really makes this step, both the attaching on the machine and the last hand binding part, they're both a lot more enjoyable and less frustrating. So I hope these tips are helpful for you. Let me know if you have other tips that I didn't get to here today, because I would love to know how I could make this step even more fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.